doing this for a while. Got involved first with HL7 version 2, and then heavily involved in version 3, and started with FHIR before it was called FHIR, when Graham had this cool idea to change things up, and I said, sure, that sounds like fun. And that consumed my life ever since. In terms of the FHIR community, I'm primarily involved in FHIR management group, FHIR infrastructure, but I also act sort of as a community liaison. If you ask a question on chat.phir.org or Stack Overflow or on the FHIR community forum, I either try to make sure that I can answer you or draw the attention of somebody else if your question has been sitting there for more than an hour or two, to make sure that the appropriate person knows that it's been asked, and hopefully that you get an answer. So I stick my fingers into as many pies as I possibly can. So I know lots and lots of things about various pieces, but not necessarily to the level of depth that some of the experts do. But I do know a fair bit about questionnaire and workflow and other aspects, and I'm pretty good at faking it in other areas. So happy to talk about whatever you like.
So for whoever wants to ask a question, please turn on your camera. And maybe just to kick it off, Lloyd, you always do sessions around structured data capture at DevDays and questionnaire and workflow. Can you just tell us briefly what's special about FHIR Workflow and why is it difficult? What's the challenge there?
Well, workflow is difficult. FHIR doesn't necessarily make it more difficult, although it adds much more in the way of options. With version 2 messaging, there's really only one, well, probably a couple of different ways of managing workflow. With CDA, there isn't really any official way to do workflow, but IHE and others have put various specifications around CDA to let you accomplish workflow with documents. FHIR, on the other hand, has documents and REST and messaging and operations and CDS hooks and all these other things that give you multiple ways of asking for something to be done or asking for data to come to you. And so the challenge is, how do we make that consistent in terms of how different implementation guides, how different workgroups are approaching workflow, but also just trying to make sure that it's clear that these options all exist and helping the implementer community to figure out what the heck they should do. Because when generally you give people 20 different options, they're not happy. They would much prefer one option or maybe two options where they only have to make a single choice as opposed to evaluating a whole bunch of things. So trying to provide that guidance and trying to agree on that guidance is something that the workflow project is spending a bit of time on. Also, we're working right now on working with some of the external standards organizations, BPMN Plus, trying to map some of what we can do in FHIR into those external standards so that people who are doing workflow not necessarily familiar with FHIR have a sense of where some of their external knowledge fits in the FHIR space. So
I missed the piece about the external standards. Can you repeat that? Which one was that?
BPMN Plus. And that is an acronym that I don't know.
Okay.
It's a workflow standard that is not healthcare specific. So whether you're doing manufacturing or you're doing logistics or whatever, it allows you to define workflow processes. And so we're looking at making sure that the workflow structures we have in FHIR, things like plan definition, we understand how our stuff maps to their stuff and vice versa. And there's actually some projects that are working on being able to transform content back and forth. And so we're reviewing their work. And when they have issues, which they invariably have issues, trying to figure out, does that mean that we should be making a change, or they should be making a change, or what? You had also asked about structured data capture. So if nobody waves their hand and says they have a question yet, I'll bring you up to speed a little bit on where things are at with that. Structured data capture is an implementation guide around questionnaire. If you saw Eric's presentation yesterday, he talked about several things in structured data capture. It's one of the oldest implementation guides in FHIR, probably only second or third to Argonaut. And the initial path was really focused on data elements and how do you populate questionnaires from CDA documents, but it turns out that nobody really wanted to do that. And so the most recent project on structured data capture is much more focused on being able to populate forms from existing FHIR instances and also extracting into other FHIR instances and adding all of the wonderful complexity that healthcare forms love to have. When you get into clinical research and other things, it's amazing how much information they can pack into a really small form. And they want the rendering of those forms to be consistent. They want things to show up in a grid, or they want things to show up in particular colors or with particular graphics. And the base resource doesn't impose all of that and doesn't define how you do all of that, because we're not expecting most systems that often have very simple forms to handle all of that stuff. But at the same time, we need to have a consistent way of defining it so that every project doesn't go off and define their own stuff. So structured data capture has really been around identifying what are all the weird and wild things that people want to be able to do, defining a consistent way of allowing that to happen, so that if you want to do advanced questionnaires, that there's an implementation guide that defines how to do pretty much anything you could want to do. And we've spent about 2.5 years developing the content for that, bringing it through ballot, going through reconciliation. And when we finished our call last Thursday, there was one outstanding element, one outstanding item that we're waiting on Graham to join us for to resolve. We'll probably have a couple more by the time we get to next Thursday's call, just because people keep testing things and trying things and asking new questions. But we are close to having the reconciliation complete. We're making good progress in having examples that actually cover everything off, which has been something that we've lacked since the very beginning. Creating good examples that cover everything is hard. So we've expended a fair bit of energy on that. And we do hope to have the final specification published sometime this summer. Although people who have heard me present on structured data capture and questionnaire before will probably take that with some significant grains of salt, because I think I promised that we would have it last summer, and then we would have it last fall, and then we would have it in January, and then we would have it this spring. And so the fact that I'm now promising it this summer, I'm pretty confident in, but the real world sometimes does weird things. So we'll see.
Thank you. Let's see. Anyone wants to ask a burning question here? Otherwise, oh, yeah, please go ahead.
So actually I have a question about dynamic questionnaires. So I believe in the questionnaire talk yesterday, it was mentioned that it's possible to create dynamic questionnaires where the server communicates with the client and essentially sends like updated versions of the questionnaires, or if I'm understanding this right. I guess like what's the current data flow for this with its current implementation, and is there anywhere that it may be going in the near future?
Sure. So dynamic questionnaires is for instruments like Promise or other situations where you don't necessarily want to expose the complete list of questions and all of the logic that's behind what questions should be exposed and when. So instead of saying, here's everything, and expecting the client to be able to manage that, the reality is some clients aren't terribly good at evaluating logic, and sometimes the logic is really complicated and ugly as well. So even if you don't have IP considerations, adaptive forms might be still attractive for that reason. The way it works is it's operation-based. So there's a single operation that you hit, and you start with an empty questionnaire response saying, I am creating a response to questionnaire whatever, specifying the URL for that questionnaire. And you hit the operation, and you get back a copy of your questionnaire response with a contained questionnaire that has just a single question in it. Or sometimes a couple of questions. Maybe there's 2 or 3 questions that it's always going to ask you, so it can, rather than going back every single time, it gives you your first 2 or 3. And you complete the answers to those, following any rules that it specifies in terms of this is mandatory, or you're allowed to specify up to 5 answers or whatever. And once you've filled those out in your questionnaire response, you send it back again with the embedded contained questionnaire, and you get back another copy of the questionnaire response, still with a contained questionnaire, this time with more questions in it. And you keep doing that over and over and over until finally, when you get back the questionnaire response is flagged as complete, i.e. you've answered everything that you're supposed to answer. And so you end up with a completed questionnaire response and a mini embedded, specific to you at this particular date and time, questionnaire that lists the specific questions that you were asked, but doesn't show you anything about what was the logic that caused those questions to be asked, or what were all of the other 150 questions that were in the data bank that it never bothered to ask you because they were deemed not relevant or important in order to get the response. Quite often in that final questionnaire response, there will also be an additional question with a filled in answer with a score based on the answers that you submitted, but it doesn't have to be that way, or it could have 5 scores or whatever happens to be relevant. The key thing is that there is no decision logic exposed to the questionnaire client. It's simply going to present the questions that it's given as it's given them and let you fill in your answers. And all of the logic is hidden in a black box behind whatever server is exposing that particular operation. And obviously, the server has to understand that particular questionnaire. You will probably find that certain servers know how to execute that operation for some questionnaires, but not necessarily for others.
Okay, thanks. That makes sense.
It's always good when it makes sense. We actually have a few proof of concept implementations of it, and it seems to work relatively well. It's actually one of the few pieces of structured data capture that's been adopted into Argonaut questionnaire. Argonaut has started tackling questionnaire last year, and their primary objective was keep things really simple. And so adaptive forms were attractive to them because, again, it offloads a bunch of the work somewhere else and lets them do very simple rendering. Other questions?
I think Jose.
I have one. Hi, greetings from Belgium. About the structured data capture, and I think it goes to data quality. How do you see the gaps or the overlaps between if I ask a patient what medication he's on as a part of a questionnaire or as a part of a medication statement, or if I just note this down as some other way? So how do you see those things working, and how do you see what's the potential for the structured data capture to be not contributing with data that is out of context or something? How do you see that?
So base challenge of healthcare is that data gets captured in different ways. So people write it on paper forms, they gather it in questionnaires, they gather it in proprietary systems, and they gather it using standards like FHIR. Questionnaire lets you capture absolutely anything. So you could define a value set using questionnaire. You can capture care plans, you can capture family history, you can capture protocols, all by filling out a questionnaire. There's no other resource in FHIR that you couldn't use questionnaire to gather exactly the same information that is present in the core elements of those resources or in any extensions you could imagine in those resources. Questionnaire is super flexible that way. But the purpose of questionnaire is really about tight control over data capture and tight control over data rendering, because quite often in healthcare you need that, and especially in research you need that. You need to know exactly what questions were asked in what order, what the text looks like for the question, what answers were available, what order they were in, how were they ordered in a grid. All of those things can actually influence how people will answer the question. And so you want some consistency there. The challenge is that when you've got a completed questionnaire response, it's not terribly searchable. It's really difficult to define search parameters that will let you dig into the data for an arbitrary questionnaire and say, find me all of the questionnaire responses that talk about this patient's potential allergy to penicillin. That's simply not possible. And so while they're super useful for gathering data and can also be useful for rendering data. So if you think about a prenatal snapshot, you often have a single piece of paper that encompasses an incredible amount of really important data in a very concise way. And so being able to take a patient's data and expose it in a questionnaire response in that standardized, really compressed form is also really useful. But in terms of interacting with the data, querying it, running statistics on it, et cetera, you want the data to be more standardized. You want it to be exposed as observations or family member history or medication statement or whatever resource is appropriate for that type of data. And so a lot of the work that we're doing with structured data capture is how do we make it easy to take data that already exists in the system and move it into a questionnaire response, which we call population, so that you're not answering the same question for the 50,000th time, what is my name and what is my phone number and what is my date of birth, because you already know that, I already know that, I don't need to tell you, just fill it in the form, because yes, I know that the form requires it because it's going off to wherever. But also on the other side of that, the extraction process, which once you've got a completed form, you can take the data that's in that form and use it to either update or create observations, procedures, medication statement, family member history, whatever it is that's relevant to reflect the data in that form that was very customized and very tuned to a specific context into resources that are much more context independent and can then be queried and embedded in messages and documents and brought together in various ways to solve a whole wide variety of use cases. Questionnaires are always very use case specific in terms of what questions are being posed and how they're being asked.
Thank you.
Gino, did you want to answer a question, or did you?
Sorry, my video wasn't on because I was eating lunch before, so.
Oh, okay.
That's all right.
But on that note, for the operation for taking the questionnaire into other resources, in the saner COVID stuff, we've been playing with that just using operations, essentially specifying, here is a, let's see, what is that? Questionnaire response. And then we want to convert it into a measure, for instance, and just doing custom operations. Are you saying, is there going to be a more generic mechanism for that, or is that just the preferred?
There is a generic mechanism for that. So there is an extract operation defined against questionnaire response in the structured data capture implementation guide.
That's why.
That would be completely appropriate for you to use. The operation used to be defined in the core spec, but there's a whole whack of text and guidance around how to actually implement it and use it that we didn't feel necessarily belonged in the core spec because it was pretty sophisticated stuff and not necessarily something that we expect is going to be implemented by most folks who do questionnaires. And the SDC implementation guide makes sense as the place to put all of that. And so we moved those operations, the both populate and extract operation, into the SDC implementation guide. But yeah, I would encourage you to leverage that. And it actually talks not only about what does the operation look like in terms of what do you pass in and what do you get back, but also what is the metadata that you embed in the questionnaire that tells the server how to execute that operation. Obviously, you could have custom code written for that specific form that knows how to extract things. In that case, you don't need anything embedded in the questionnaire. But if you're going to have a general purpose operation that takes an arbitrary questionnaire response and knows how to generate data out of it, then you need something in the questionnaire that tells you how do you do that. And there's actually 3 different ways of performing that extraction process. There's a very simple one that is observation driven, because probably 70 to 80% of the forms that we do in healthcare are a whole whack of observations. How was this today? How was that today? How many of these did you do? How many of that did you do? So it's all observations. And so that's a very simple process of your questionnaire questions have observation codes on them, and there's a little bit of additional metadata that talks about when do you create versus when do you update, and boom, it's done. There are more sophisticated mechanisms that leverage FHIR, or you can get down to the level of a full-blown structure map, which lets you do all sorts of weird, wild, and wonderful things, but requires that you understand how to create structure maps, which is not a skill that a whole lot of people yet have. But
no, but for a canonical definition, saying here's a canonical questionnaire and here's a canonical measure format,
yep.
Then that defining canonical structure map would work very well for that.
Absolutely. Yeah, if you have access to a resource who knows how to create the structure map, that gives you the most flexibility in terms of answering the questions however you might like to ask them, and then have the resource look however you want. When you're looking at something like FHIR, there's situations where you sort of have to model the questionnaire in a way that's similar to the resource, because there isn't as much potential for transformation. Structure map, on the other hand, lets you transform like crazy.
Yeah, and in this case, we're trying to match the government requested forms as closely as possible in the layout. So having that flexibility there would be very good. So
yeah,
awesome. Thank you.
So yeah, there is a standard operation that you can use and standard extensions to embed in your questionnaire that point to the structure map to use in the conversion process.
Okay, and that's all in the ballot versions, or just in, I assume?
Yeah, it's in the ballot version of STC. It's all I would probably look at the continuous integration build, which has had a whole bunch of changes made since, and it's getting closer. Sorry, I didn't catch that, Eugene.
Oh, it's also not found. So.
It's also not found.
Yeah, hl7.org/FHIR/UV SDC history. And then when you go to current, it just gives a 404.
Oh, that's special. We should probably fix that. Let me show you where it is. So this is the continuous integration site.
Okay.
Do I have the ability to post chat comments? No, I don't. But it's not that hard. build.phir.org/ig/hl7/STC.
No worries.
And then from here, under specification, there's a whole section on data extraction. And if you go into the artifact index and scroll down to operations, they're not rendering. That's not good. All right, well, we will try to fix that soon. You know where to find me on chat.phir.org. So poke me there. And I will let you know as soon as that's fixed. Joey's here as well, so she's helping me out with getting the IG polished, and we'll work together on making it.
I just figured out the history page is pointing to the proper URL, but relative, not full.
Okay.
So going from hl7.org, it tries to find the same path on hl7.org.
Okay.
.phir.org.
So.
All right, we'll get that fixed.
Needs a fix. One question here in the session Q&A.
It's not relative, it's just wrong, but I'm fixing it now.
Oh, okay.
Look at that.
It's always nice when the right people are on the call.
Improving this. I have a question here, Lloyd, from Linda. Where are you with finalizing the FHIR IG templates? And probably that's for the ballotable IGs, the templates, but maybe for the folks in the meeting who don't know what that's about, maybe you can explain a little bit and then answer Linda's question.
Sure. So the IG publisher is really powerful. I've created a bunch of IGs that have vastly different renderings, driven by the requirements of different projects. Let me actually see if I can find one of the cooler ones and bring it up. But with that power, of course, comes complexity. It actually takes quite a lot of work to design a set of input files that will cause an implementation guide to render the way that you'd actually like it to. And most people don't have the time or skills or interest to undertake that. So what was typically happening is that people would find an implementation guide that they kind of liked, and then they would copy the content of that IG, including whatever framework it was using, and then they would insert their own artifacts into that, and everybody would sort of progress that way. But what that meant is that if you made enhancements or improvements to how a given implementation guide looked or fixed bugs, those wouldn't necessarily propagate terribly well. So everybody was sort of stuck on wherever they had done their copy and paste snapshots. So this is an implementation guide I did for a customer here in Canada. And this actually uses exactly the same framework, the same, or not the same framework, but the same publication tooling as in the standard HL7 style implementation guides like this one. So the only difference here is in the layouts and the HTML files that define the look and feel of the implementation guide, some of the JavaScript and CSS files and stuff like that. And so it would be really nice if when people made changes and enhancements and added things like this little hover over that lets you copy a link, if that actually showed up everywhere. And also if there was a degree of consistency where the IGs that I publish versus the IGs that Eric Haas publishes versus IGs published by somebody else, all of which claim to be HL7 implementation guides, kind of had the same look and feel. And an implementer who was familiar with how to navigate one implementation guide would feel comfortable and at home navigating any HL7 implementation guide. Obviously, ones published by AHE might look a little different. Ones published by some government in Japan or whatever would look different. Those published in Israel would look very different. But where we can at least get consistency within an organization, that would be nice. And so templates is a mechanism where all of the frameworky kind of stuff that defines headers and footers and layouts and how the menus work and all of that kind of stuff is now managed as a separate Git project from your IG content itself. And that then means that we can update that template, and when you publish your IG, you get the new enhanced look and feel. So if we have fixed bugs or we've added enhancements, or your footer is now works better on an iPhone than it used to, or all of those kinds of things, that just happens automatically, and you don't have to worry about it. In terms of when are we going to have standardized templates, and when is that going to be done? Never. We have now a standard official HL7 template and an HL7 FHIR template and a CDA template, and sitting on top of those we have a DaVinci template. And we have not yet declared a thou shalt to IG publishers to say you must use them, but we're probably getting close to the point where we're ready to do that. Eric Haas is the maintainer of the other major IG style, and he's been doing a fair bit of work to update the template to include the key things that he really wants to see. And we're getting close to having most of those merged. And so I expect that the FHIR management group will relatively soon put a line in the sand and say, if you are planning to ballot in January 2021 or later, an HL7IG, you shall use the standard template. But in terms of when is that template never going to change? Hopefully not for a long time, because I suspect people will continue to have new ideas about how to make it render nicer, how to do new things. Like I would love to be able to reference a JSON fragment inline in my text, but have that JSON fragment actually referenced in my IG content, so it's actually part of a real example that gets validated. And when the resource changes, it'll yell at me because the example isn't right, and so I fix the example. Whereas right now what we do is we hard code and escape JSON in the instance, and it's not necessarily checked by anything. Graham has some magic that checks it some of the time, but for something like CDS6, there's no way to check it. And so there's lots of things that we will do when and if we have time, and that other people can do, because it's a Git project like any other, and you can make pull requests. Jose's actually done tons of work on enhancing the templates and improving what they do. So I expect them to continue to evolve, but in terms of what the templates look like in terms of authoring, that's now pretty solid. So you can author against the template and be relatively confident that we're not going to break things, or if we do come to a point where, yes, we're going to shift what the input needs to look like, we'll at least give you a transformation process that you can run against your project that will make it run with the new version of the template.
So, Linda, I bet you had a reason for asking this question. Is your question answered now, or?
It is. We're in the process of adding content, and as you mentioned, Eric is aligning the DEQM to the template so we can add content to it. So I was curious if what we're doing right now is close to complete. So it sounds like it is for now, but new features to come. The framework's the same, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Eric's been working hard on getting his stuff to work nicely in the template. And so far he hasn't told me anything's broken. We've had some intense discussions about things, but we've resolved everything so far.
I would expect no less.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Jose, I see you ready for a question.
Yep, if I still have time.
You have.
It's about the, so coming R5 or the next release of FHIR. How do you see, Lloyd? So what's your vision and your expectations for the work that has been done on patterns? So some harmonization between different types of resources. Where do you think that's going to lead us? I've been listening to discussions, but I'm interested to see also what's the ultimate vision there, or what do you think would be the outcome of that?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the early outcomes of the workflow project, is defining the request and definition and event patterns to try to get greater consistency across a bunch of resources that are defined in FHIR that are doing similar kinds of things, but obviously authored by different people, and so had different names for attributes with the same purpose, or different data types or cardinalities or whatever. And sometimes for good reason, and sometimes the only reason is different people were in the room and thinking about the problem differently. And so the objective with the pattern was to try to drive greater consistency, not necessarily to say that everything needs to be the same, but at least that different resources created by different authors weren't different only because they were written by different people. That if we could have consistency, that we would actually have consistency. So the patterns have helped with that. We've struggled a little bit on the tooling side and just on the governance side to have work groups actually go through those patterns and declare where they are divergent, why. So that, I mean, the patterns continue to evolve, the resources continue to evolve, and we don't have a good computable validation mechanism in place yet that helps us to ensure that where we have variances, the variances are deliberate, and ideally that documents why the variances are there, so that implementers looking at a resource can say, oh, this is different than the common way, and here's why it's different, and yes, that makes sense to me, or alternatively, no, that doesn't make sense to me. I think that the fact that you've constrained that to one because you say nobody does more than one isn't true, and here's my evidence for that, so you can have a productive discussion. It's bandwidth question. So if somebody happens to have bandwidth and is willing to help us work on tooling to better test that and capture that documentation, that would be wonderful. Obviously, we don't want to impose tons and tons of work on the work groups in terms of doing that documentation, because they have limited bandwidth too. But I think we can probably do better than we are. We may also start to see patterns developing in other areas. We've explored the notion of having a product pattern, and we're working with the orders and observations work group around that. We may have others as well. We haven't bothered with the pattern around person because all of those resources are managed by a single work group, and they thus far have done a pretty good job of ensuring consistency where they think consistency makes sense, though having a pattern may still be helpful in terms of having the documentation around variances and justifying why do you have the C state on patient, but you don't have the C state on practitioner or things like that. And so that's still an area where things could possibly evolve.
Thank you, Lloyd. We have time for a final question. Who wants to?
If I can jump in with a follow-up on that one.
Go
Actually,
ahead.
Since
Can I
have
interrupt too for 1 second,
Oh.
Gina? I'm sorry. No, actually, I'm just going to say I don't want to end the discussion. If you guys want to go over, we absolutely can. We have this Zoom room for as long as we need to. So if people want to stay on, we can keep going.
Okay, but we let's do one more question. Gino, go ahead.
No worries. I just, having Lloyd and Graham and then Jose asking that question. For the tooling, I brought up, when was that, last week, about concept map, how it says it inherits from canonical resource, that's the base type. Is that, I was going to file a JIRA for it, but I wanted to ask, is that the intention that it stays that way, or should I file a JIRA to change that? Particularly, in this case, it's defined that that's the base resource, but then it does have a variance for the identifier that it's 0, 1 instead of 0 star. So you can't actually inherit from the type, but that says it's the base type.
So we just dove into the really deep end of the pool. We have had for a while this notion of a different style of pattern that drives some consistency around what we've historically called infrastructure resources, things like structure definition, value set, implementation guide, et cetera. And Graham recently exposed those more formally in the tooling. But we have, one of the challenges we have is with those sorts of pattern resources where we align value set and structure definition, we haven't necessarily forced everything to have exactly the same behavior, because there are situations where it actually makes sense for some resources to look a little bit different than others. And so from an interface perspective, you could expose all of those resources as that one sort of generic pattern and manipulate them that way. But it's not true inheritance. It's more of an interface kind of thing. But we have not exposed that difference when we talk about based on. And so my leaning is that a change request that says these things are not exactly the same, but we're treating them like they're the same, and that's confusing. We should be not confusing, would be a good thing for us to do. What the solution will be there, I don't know. If you really are interested to see what the solution to that will be, come and join us on our FHIR infrastructure calls, where we will probably be taking that up, possibly on Monday or Monday soon. I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to all of the other people who are on the call. So if they find that really interesting, then that's the place to come and do that kind of cool stuff.
Okay.
Anybody who has more questions for me, I'm certainly happy to talk now, but Rian is suggesting that he's not quite so happy for me to keep talking now.
No, you are fine.
But
It's just that I got to leave for my next meeting.
You got to leave. That's fine.
Please stay as long as you wish, but I'm no longer moderating.
Sure.
Yeah, you've got me out here if you need it.
Excellent. But chat.fire.org is the place to ask questions, period. You can ask private questions of me, but don't do that unless it's really something that is Lloyd specific. It's much better to post them on implementers or one of the other streams, because then you don't rely on me getting to your question. I'm pretty responsive, but not always. Whereas if you ask on the public forum, you not only get faster response, but you get a wider set of responses, and you will help everybody else. And that's one of the key things about chat.fire.org is that you learn not only from the questions that you ask, but you learn from the questions that everybody else asks, and you learn from this ability to search an enormous repository of questions that people have asked before you and see what the discussion was and save yourselves immense amounts of time, because you don't have to wait for anybody then. If you can find it in a search, then you're done. And so that community repository is really essential, and it also helps to drive consistency across implementations, because we can't put everything in the spec. If we tried to put everything in the spec, it would be huge and nobody would read it. So even if it wasn't the spec, it wouldn't make a difference. But having the community where you can say, I'm trying to do X, and what is the best way to solve this particular problem, that is something that chat.fire.org is really good at, because you will then find out that, hey, there's this project in the Netherlands that's doing this, or yeah, we've implemented that last year in Brazil, and here was the results, and we had these issues. And that will guide you in avoiding the missteps that others have taken, and create solutions that are much more likely to plug and play with what other people are building, which of course is your objective. You want to do things in a way that's consistent with others so that they don't have to customize their code to talk to you, and you don't have to further customize your code to talk to them. You want things to flow as easily as they can, as quickly as they can. And the way that you do that is by talking to other people. And we've got 12,000 or something crazy like that people in chat.fire.org now. And so there's lots of people in the community to talk to. Not all of them are that vocal, and very few people can read everything. I generally actually keep my chat.fire.org clean. All of the threads that I follow, I try to clean at the end of the day, which is a lot of work. Most people don't do that and shouldn't try to do that, but it's there as a resource. So do take advantage of that. Other questions?
No, it looks like people are starting to drop off. So Lloyd, I just want to thank you very much for your time today with this. It was fantastic. I think we got a lot of great information from you. So thank you very much. And anyone else who's still out here, this will be, this was recorded, so we'll go ahead and post that on Whova tomorrow, so you guys can listen to any of the questions that were covered if you needed more information or the direct links that Lloyd was talking about. So
awesome.
Thanks so much, guys, and we'll see you soon in the next meeting.
Awesome. Thanks, Marianne.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Lloyd.